Welcome to the debate. When you look at a really magnificent skyscraper, you naturally marvel at the skyline silhouette. You admire the glass facade, the way it catches the morning light, just the sleek aesthetic of the finished product. What you don't do is stand on the sidewalk admiring the rebar, the load-bearing columns, and all those structural joints hidden deep inside the concrete.
Well, no, we really only care about the rebar when the building starts swaying a little too much in the wind, or worse, when it's collapsing. I mean, generally, we like what is visible. We like the polished rendering of the building.
Exactly, yeah. But when you step into the architecture of professional memory, that hidden rebar is, well, it's suddenly the most fiercely debated material in the room. So today, we are examining the architectural philosophy underlying the living professional record, which we'll just refer to as the LPR.
Right. Specifically, we're zooming in on the critical transition described in the LPR Academy doctrine as Toolkit 5 and assembly.
Which is really where the abstract theory of tracking your professional life hits the pavement.
It is. Yeah, the source material outlines how the LPR moves beyond just having, good evidence of your work and gets into actual system architecture. Clip 7 of the text explicitly states that Toolkit 5 shows how the living professional record is assembled. The earlier toolkits produce parts, but Toolkit 5 assembles the record.
Right. And the key lesson they emphasize is that worksheets are not the final system. The assembled LPR is the governed source. Precisely. And that brings us to the central disagreement we are exploring today. Does the true essence and value of the living professional record emerge only during that final assembly of its governed relationships, or does its ultimate power reside in the rigorous foundational capture of the raw evidence itself?
It's a fundamental question of where the actual truth of your career lives, really. Does it live in the system, or does it live in the dirt?
I tend to look at this from the assembly side. To me, a folder full of documents, even, highly detailed documents, isn't a professional record until you build the structural connections. The governance, the systemic assembly of those parts is what actually makes it an LPR.
Yeah, and my pushback on that is that the LPR's integrity is entirely rooted in the granular, foundational capture of evidence and context. Assembly is a structural necessity, sure, but it's just a packaging step. The core value is the uncompromised raw material.
Let's unpack that. Because if you're listening to this and wondering why we care so much about this word governance, think about the last time you updated your resume.
Oh, painful.
Right? You probably stared at a blank page, tried to remember what you actually did 3 years ago, and ended up just typing out some vague corporate buzzwords. The LPR Academy explicitly warns against treating your career history like a brag file or, a credential wallet.
Right, because a brag file just lists outcomes. It doesn't actually prove anything.
Precisely. And that's why the earlier toolkits exist. Toolkit 1 captures the raw evidence, emails, code commits, project plans. Toolkit 2 reconstructs the context surrounding that evidence. Then Toolkit 3 identifies your value patterns. Toolkit 3.5 translates that value into market lanes so you know what you're actually selling. And Toolkit 4 creates controlled renderings, like a resume or a LinkedIn profile. But here is my core point. Isolated, these are just disconnected fragments.
Right.
A pile of truth is not a system. The LPR only becomes a functioning worker-owned source system when Toolkit 5 assembles these fragments into a governed relationship. The sequence, connecting the evidence to the context, to the claim, to the privacy settings, to the rendering, that assembly is the record.
I hear the appeal of that structural elegance, I really do. But let's look at what is actually happening inside those foundational toolkits. If Toolkit 1 fails to accurately capture real, hard evidence in the evidence vault, or if Toolkit 2 fails to reconstruct the actual context of a project, your final assembly is completely hollow.
So you don't think the governance of those materials matters?
Well, no, I think a governed system is meaningless if it governs flawed, inflated, or just unsupported materials. Let's ground this in a real-world scenario. Imagine a product manager who has dropped into a failing software launch. Half the engineering team has quit, the budget is slashed, and the client is threatening a lawsuit.
Oh, a classic crisis management scenario.
Exactly. So
our PM manages to stabilize the rollout and deliver a functional, albeit, scaled back product. Now in Toolkit 1, they capture the raw evidence, the revised JIRA boards, the crisis meeting notes, the final client sign-off. In Toolkit 2, they capture the context, the slashed budget, the inherited failure, the tight time constraints.
Right.
If they don't capture those foundational truths accurately and privately, what exactly is Toolkit 5 assembling? If you have an empty or inaccurate evidence vault, your highly governed assembly is just a very sophisticated structure protecting a fiction. I mean, the soul of the record has to be that uncompromised foundational capture.
That's a compelling scenario, but it actually highlights the exact error the Academy warns us against. If we fetishize the foundational capture, just hoarding documents and context notes, we risk reducing the LPR to a static archive. Let me introduce a mechanical analogy here.
Okay.
You can meticulously forge the pistons. That's your Toolkit 1 capturing the evidence of the JIRA boards, right? And you can craft the perfect spark plugs. That's Toolkit 2, reconstructing the context of the slashed budget. But until they are timed and connected in a governed system through Toolkit 5, you do not have an engine. You just have a heavy, useless pile of metal sitting on a garage floor.
I like the engine analogy, but what if those beautifully forged pistons are made of glass? I mean, the engine still explodes the second you turn the key. The structural connection doesn't save the engine. It actively exposes the flaw. This is why the contribution record, which is part of that foundational capture, is so incredibly vital.
Because it forces the worker to define their exact role?
Yes. Work is inherently collective. That product manager didn't code the software. They didn't write the legal contracts for the client. The contribution record answers the fundamental question of, what did this worker actually do? Did they own the turnaround, coordinate it, or just, observe it from the sidelines?
Right, the exact level of involvement.
Exactly. Clarifying whether the PM led the transformation or merely supported implementation tracking happens long before we ever reach Toolkit 5. That granular accuracy, down in the dirt, in the early toolkits, is what actually prevents claim inflation.
Okay, I agree that the contribution record prevents inflation at the moment of capture. But how do you ensure that context survives over a 5-year career span? It's the systemic assembly that ensures the contribution record doesn't get separated from the raw evidence over time. Let's shift our focus to how the outside world actually sees this data. When a client or a recruiter looks at a professional, they are looking at what we call the rendering layer.
The surfaces, the resume, the bio, the interview answers.
Right. Toolkit 4 creates those controlled renderings, but it is the finalized assembly of Toolkit 5 that forces those external renderings to remain tethered to the private source layer. I mean, the doctrine explicitly states that a rendering does not replace the record.
Sure.
So if we don't have the final assembled governance structure, what is stopping our product manager from letting their public LinkedIn profile drift away from the private truth over time? Without assembly, memory fades, the ego takes over, and stabilized a rollout suddenly morphs into single-handedly revolutionized global product strategy. The assembly is the tether that physically prevents that drift.
The tether you were talking about isn't actually anchored in the assembly layer. It is anchored in the claim map and the claim status guide, which are direct products of the foundational evidence. Accountability doesn't just magically appear because you put a binder clip on a stack of papers.
It's more than a binder clip, though.
It appears because every single claim has been mapped to a specific piece of evidence.
But that mapping is a system of relationships. That is assembly.
The coordinates are foundational, though. Look at how the claim status guide actually functions. If a claim status is labeled supported, emerging, or needs confirmation, that maturity label is derived directly from the density of evidence in Toolkit 1.
Okay.
If our product manager claims they improved onboarding consistency, and the only evidence is a rough draft of a checklist, well, the foundation flags that claim as emerging. If they have the checklist, a manager's review, and adoption metrics, it gets flagged as supported. Toolkit 5 just displays the map to the user. The foundational toolkits did the hard work of surveying the territory.
I'll concede it that the foundation provides the coordinates, but an isolated coordinate isn't a map. A map is, by definition, an assembled system of relationships. and the text is unequivocal on the vulnerability of disconnected parts. Think about the privacy layer. This isn't just about protecting the worker's ego. It's about protecting third parties, proprietary company data, and confidential client financials.
Which is a massive liability if handled poorly.
Exactly. The doctrine states that privacy must travel with the evidence and the claim. Let's say our product manager has a confidential postmortem report detailing the software failure. That report proves they saved the project, so it's incredibly valuable evidence for them. But it also contains proprietary company data.
Right. Highly sensitive.
If that evidence is separated from its privacy boundaries, if it's just a raw file sitting on a hard drive somewhere, there is a massive risk that the worker accidentally uploads it to a public portfolio.
Because the system didn't stop them.
Because they didn't have a system, they just had parts. Toolkit 5 assembles a structure where that highly sensitive report is systemically locked to a do not upload or metadata only label. The governance ensures the privacy layer acts like a digital watermark embedded in the file rather than, a sticky note that just falls off the folder. That fail-safe mechanism is entirely a product of assembly.
Ooh, that's a strong point about the digital watermark. The fail-safe is definitely important. But if we obsess over this rigid, fully governed assembly, we risk paralyzing the worker. I mean, the LPR is supposed to be a living professional record. It requires constant maintenance. The maintenance log dictates that the system has to be updated after a project ends, after a performance review, after earning a credential.
Which makes the governance of those continuous updates even more vital, doesn't it?
Not necessarily, because the text introduces the concept of a minimum viable record. A client doesn't need a fully architected toolkit 5 governed database to start protecting themselves. Building a minimum viable record proves that the raw parts hold immediate protective value.
In the short term, maybe?
Just taking 10 minutes to write a raw entry in a decision and judgment log about why you chose to cut a software feature in a crisis, even before it's connected to a privacy layer or a claim map, protects the worker's memory today. If we demand perfect assembly right out of the gate, workers will just procrastinate and capture nothing.
You're relying heavily on the immediate value of raw data. But let's look at what happens when that raw data interacts with modern tools, specifically artificial intelligence. The AI translation log is a perfect example of why governance must supersede raw capture. Let's say our PM wants to use AI to draft a resume bullet point from that raw decision and judgment log.
A very common use case, yeah.
Right. They feed the context notes into the AI. The AI, doing what AI does, hallucinates a bit to sound impressive and suggests spearheaded organizational transformation resulting in 0 defects. The human reads that, realizes it's a massive overstatement, and corrects it to stabilized, localized rollout under constrained budget. Now, how does the LPR handle that?
Well, the human governs the foundational claim by rejecting the AI's inflation.
Yes, but the log itself is a mechanism of assembly. It explicitly tracks the source material used, the claims accepted, the claims rejected, and the final approved rendering. The doctrine states AI assists, the human governs, but that governance is a systemic architecture. If you just have a foundational folder of raw Slack messages and another folder of AI-generated resume drafts, you have professional amnesia. You've completely lost the provenance of how you got from point A to point B. Toolkit 5's assembly is what forces the AI translation log to act as a secure bridge rather than just a dumping ground for generated text.
I see your point about the bridge, but let's walk back across that bridge and look at what the AI is actually translating, the context layer. In a purely systemic, assembly-focused view, the final rendering, that resume bullet, might just objectively state that a project missed its original deadline but shipped a month later.
Which looks like a failure on paper.
Precisely. But the context layer, built early in the foundational process, captures the constraints. It captures that the PM inherited the project after a previous failure, that they were severely under-resourced, and that shipping it a month late actually prevented a catastrophic multi-million-dollar loss. The text explicitly says, context is not decoration, context is part of the claims.
I don't disagree with that. Context is the difference between a failure and a rescue.
It is the truth of the work. And if the foundational toolkit doesn't extract that context, the stakes, the time pressure, the before and after conditions, then your perfectly assembled Toolkit 5 bridge is just going to efficiently and systematically govern a misrepresentation. It will just cleanly export a failure to your resume. The assembly doesn't create the defense against misinterpretation. The contextual capture in Toolkit 2 does. The context layer absolutely protects meaning at the source. I will grant you that. But again, we have to ask, how is that meaning retained over time? Let's bring in the witness and feedback layer. A lot of professional context doesn't live in Jira boards or Slack messages. It lives in people. Say a VP saw our product manager handle the client's anger during that crisis. That evidence is a human memory.
And witnesses are incredibly specific. You can't just treat them like a generic reference on a traditional resume.
Exactly. And that specificity is an architectural requirement. The system has to connect the specific witness to the specific claim, bound by specific privacy limits. If you merely capture the VP's name and a foundational note about what they saw, you haven't actually protected the worker.
Why not? The worker knows who saw what.
Because human memory is fallible and the rendering process is high pressure. The assembly dictates that before a reference list is generated, the system runs a check. Does this claim rely on a witness? Are they still at the company? Are they safe to contact? Or, is there a conflict of interest now? What specific piece of the project should they not be asked to verify because they weren't in the room?
Right.
The governance structure stops the worker from making a catastrophic error, like having a recruiter call a VP who isn't clear to discuss a confidential client. That failsafe is assembly.
I completely understand the value of the failsafe, but the error is prevented because the witness layer was rigorously defined at the foundation. The foundation asks the hard question of what did they actually see? If the foundation is weak, like if the PM just logs, the VP loved my work, the assembly just efficiently executes a bad command. It confidently tells the recruiter to call the VP, who then says, I wasn't really involved in that part of the project. Garbage in, garbage out. Let's look at another foundational element, the learning log.
Right, tracking professional development and upskilling over time.
Yes, but the doctrine emphasizes it's not just a list of courses you took. It tracks what that learning actually supports in terms of your capabilities. Let's say our PM took an AI basics course. The learning log forces them to distinguish between mere exposure, active practice, supervised use, and mature capability.
The maturity scale.
Exactly. An introductory course supports an emerging AI literacy claim. It absolutely does not support an AI transformation leader claim. Making that distinction is a foundational act of evidence literacy. The assembly merely reads the label that the foundation painstakingly determined.
I hear you, but let's look at how human behavior actually operates. Under pressure, the foundation determines the label, sure, but the assembly enforces it. Imagine our PM is writing a proposal for a new job. They are stressed, they are under a massive time crunch. They look at their foundational learning log, they see the AI course, and in the heat of the moment, they inflate the claim. They type AI transformation leader onto the resume.
Yeah, well, the temptation to inflate is always there.
But if they have an assembled record, it creates a structural barrier against that temptation. The claim map is systemically connected to the claim status guide. When they try to pull that AI leader claim into a rendering, the system flags it. It says, wait, the underlying evidence for this is just an introductory course. The status is emerging, not proven.
The system only catches the drift because the foundation planted a flag there in the first place. The system didn't generate the emerging label. The honest, foundational assessment of the raw evidence did.
We are circling the same profound tension here, aren't we? It is the tension between the raw material and the governed architecture.
It is, and it's a tension that every professional, and frankly every advisor helping them, has to navigate. If you just build the architecture, if you set up all the beautiful folders, the privacy layers, the claim maps, but you don't obsess over the truth of the materials going into them, the architecture is empty. If you don't dig into the decision and judgment log to capture the ethical boundaries and trade-offs a client actually navigated in a crisis, your Toolkit 5 assembly is just a shiny shell.
And conversely, if you just hoard incredibly detailed records of trade-offs, constraints, and context notes, but you never link them into a governed claim map, well, you are paralyzed. You have a brilliant, truthful diary that can never safely be translated into a resume, a bio, or an interview answer because the risk of disconnection is just too high.
Which brings us to a very clear point of convergence in the doctrine, I think. The text is absolute on this. The resume is merely a rendering. The full record is private by default, and the worker owns the source layer.
We unequivocally agree on that. The Academy warns us explicitly not to reduce the LPR to an employer dossier, a public LinkedIn profile, or a credential wallet. Worksheets are not the final destination.
Right, because the rendering layer, what the public sees, must always remain accountable to the source layer, what the worker privately knows to be true.
Exactly. Well, let's summarize where we've landed in this discussion. My perspective remains that the living professional record fundamentally transcends its individual worksheets because the governed assembly of Toolkit 5 is what protects truth from becoming mere disconnected artifacts. It is the systemic connection linking the evidence to the context, to the claim, to the privacy settings, and finally to the rendering that acts at the immune system against professional amnesia and claim inflation.
And my perspective maintains that while the LPR undeniably requires that systemic architecture to function in the real world, its soul, its integrity, and its ultimate utility are forever anchored in the uncompromised foundational capture. The evidence fault, the contribution record, the context layer, this is where the actual work of interpretation is fought and won. An architecture is only as strong as the truth it governs. If the foundation is glass, the engine shatters.
It seems this tension isn't a flaw in the system, but rather the exact mechanism that ensures a professional's memory remains both truthful and highly functional. You cannot have a governed source system without rigorous source material. And raw source material is deeply vulnerable without governance.
Yeah, it requires both. You need the meticulously forged materials, and you need the expertly timed engine assembly to actually drive forward.
Which brings us right back to where we started. When you look at a magnificent skyscraper, you are seeing a rendering. You are seeing the glass and the steel shining in the sun, designed for public consumption. But beneath that surface, ensuring the building doesn't collapse under the pressure of the wind or the passage of time, is the hidden, governed architecture. The rebar, the concrete, the structural connections. The true strength of your professional memory isn't in what you show the world. It's in the private, governed system you build beneath it.